On the morning the well finally died, the farmer found a cabin that hadn't been there yesterday. It sat crooked in a thin stand of cottonwoods beyond the last wire fence, weather gray and stubborn against the empty sky, as if the earth itself had coughed it up overnight. He wiped dust from his eyes, blinked again, and the place was still there, a box of shadow with a door like a shut mouth. The fields behind him were a quilt of failure, crisp stalks rattling like bones, and the horizon flickered with heat that had teeth. He walked toward it, boots crunching on ground that had forgotten softness. There were no tracks, no path, no sign of the county road or a neighbor having passed this way. Only the cabin, the silence, and the steady scrape of his boot heels counting the steps like a slow prayer. Up close, the boards were chewed by time. Moss clung to a seam of shingles green as if it remembered a different climate. A rusted latch held the door shut, and in the window a square of glass reflected his face back at him, sunburnt, lined, a map drawn by years that had not asked permission. A whisper rose from inside, so thin he might have mistaken it for wind through grass if there had been any grass left to move. It wasn't words. It was a tone, a low vowel hum like the throat of a church organ, and beneath it a faint rhythmic tapping. Tap, pause, tap, pause. He knew that sound from nights spent listening to the failing pump, mechanical heartbeats counting down. He told himself the tapping was a broken shutter. He told himself the hum was bees in the wall. He told himself a lot of things and believed none of them. He didn't open it. Not yet. There was a rule in him, the kind born out of drought and debt and grief. You don't rush what might be a miracle or a curse. You circle it. You test the fences. He walked the perimeter. He found no foundation, only stones set in an oval, like a necklace half buried in dust. He found a carved mark on the north wall, a symbol he'd seen once in a book about stations on the Underground Railroad, a lantern etched by a careful hand. He found under the eaves a bell rope that had rotted and mended and rotted again, tied with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for night. Tap, pause, tap. He put his ear to the wood. The cabin sighed as if it had lungs, and in that breath he heard water. Impossible water moving through darkness. His throat tightened with thirst so sharp it felt like shame. He had prayed for rain and got a building. He had asked for a way to keep his land and got a door that would not open itself. On the threshold, the farmer finally spoke out loud to nobody and to God. "If this is a test," he said, "let me pass it." Then he lifted the latch. He stepped back and studied the seams where the cabin met the dust, looking for the obvious trick. Skid marks from a trailer, fresh gouges from a backhoe, tire patterns braided like snakes. Nothing. Only wind-scrolled dust and the faint ovals where rabbits had once slept. He looked for a name burned into wood, a number stamped on a hinge, a county permit nailed up crooked. There was only the bell rope, still and frayed, and the way the cottonwoods seemed to lean in as witnesses. A blackbird lit on the ridgepole, cocked its head, and let out a single note that was not quite a song and not quite a warning. He ran his thumb along the latch and felt a notch worn by use. Others had stood here. Others had asked the door to keep their secrets or give them up. He held his breath and counted to 7 the way his mother had taught him, when fear tried to gallop. 1 for each day God had insisted the world could be made from nothing, and when he reached 7, he did not move. He listened instead to the tapping that had become as steady as his pulse. It was not angry. It was not begging. It was only waiting. He stood, listening to the earth, and did not yet open the door. His name was Jonah Miller, and by the time the cabin appeared on his back 40, he had learned to count blessings in single digits. The roof over his head, though it leaked. The 2 cows that still gave milk, though you could read the ribs under their hides. The worn Bible on his nightstand, full of pencil notes and coffee rings. The photo of his late father stuck in the frame of the kitchen mirror, scolding him every morning to keep going. Jonah's hands were a map of calluses and split knuckles, and his back spoke to him at night in a language of aches. He was a poor farmer, American to the bone, with a patch of land that felt like both a promise and a debt. If you're drawn to stories where ordinary people face strange turns of fate, where dry ground yields secrets and faith holds a lantern against the wind, subscribe now and stay with me through this tale. It's a story about a poor American farmer and a door that opened onto the past, the present, and something like mercy. Click subscribe, share this with a friend who needs hope, and settle in. The sound you hear might be your own heart, or it might be the beginning of water. Jonah's farm sat 3 miles from the interstate and 50 years from luck. After his father died, debt flowed in like a river running backwards. He stopped leaving church before the benediction. He sold the tractor with the bad clutch for half of what it was worth. He learned how to keep the lights on with a spiral notebook and late-night arithmetic, sell the spare baler teeth, patch the fences with bent nails, carry the note one more month. When the well began spitting rust, he rationed baths and prayers. The drought was not a season anymore. It was a roommate that didn't pay rent and broke things. The land had been his grandfather's. The old man used to say the soil remembered kindness. Jonah had a memory packed with small generosities. The teacher who kept him after school to teach him to read better. The neighbor who arrived after a storm with a chainsaw and a smile. His mother, tired to the bone, who hummed hymns over the sink to keep fear from spreading. Those memories clipped to him like clothespins, keeping the daily work from blowing away. But the drought taught different lessons. It taught how silence can be loud. It taught how the mind roams when the horizon is empty. It taught how easily one thought turns into another darker one. Maybe you sell. Maybe you go. Maybe the farm survives, but you don't. On the night before the cabin appeared, Jonah sat on the porch under a sky that looked like hammered steel and told his father's photo he might sign the papers next week. The bank manager had a face that never sweated. The rich man 3 farms over had left a card with his number and the soft threat of help. That was when a flicker moved in the cottonwoods and a crow called twice, like a warning or an invitation. Jonah went to bed with the window open to catch whatever breeze wanted to visit, slept in shallow spoonfuls and woke before dawn to a silence he could feel pressing on his chest. The well gave its last cough. The kettle hissed and went quiet. Through the gray light he saw the boxy silhouette in the far stand of trees. Geometry, where there had been nothing but brush and sunburnt air. His first thought was that somebody had set up a hunting blind. His second thought was that he was losing his mind. The third thought, the one that stuck, was that some promises come wearing work clothes. He saddled belief like a nervous horse and rode it out to the cabin. Humility is a muscle you grow by lifting what breaks you. Faith is the hand that steadies the weight. Jonah had both, but both shook that morning. He stood before the door and felt the air change. Cooler, laced with a scent that clawed old memories awake. Wet rope, iron, river stones. He thought of baptisms, of the river Saturdays when his mother would sit with her feet in the shallows and laugh like she wasn't tired. He reached for the latch and let his palm rest there, the way you set a hand on a shoulder before saying a hard thing. He tried to remember when he had last laughed in a way that surprised him. Maybe at the county fair 2 summers back, when a calf he'd bottle-fed decided his shirt tasted better than its own grain and chased him in front of the school board president. Maybe the morning he found an arrowhead in the far pasture and, just for a heartbeat, felt the past reaching up to touch his boot. Mostly, lately, laughter was something other people did in rooms with air conditioning. His humor had become a tool, like pliers. Useful, not pretty. He saved his best jokes for calves and crows in the mailbox. His faith wasn't a fireworks kind. It didn't ask for applause. It was the kind that turns lights off when you leave a room and still thanks the light when you flip the switch. It was the kind that shows up to church when the sermon is long and the pew is hard and the grocery money is low. It was the kind that made him press his palm to the kitchen table every morning and say, "Lord, let me be decent today," as if decency might grow like beans if you planted it regular. He did not ask for miracles. He asked for enough. Before we step into that cabin, I'll ask you this. Stay with me. And if this story steadies you, subscribe so you don't miss the ones to come. Stories, like water, travel better when they're shared. The channel keeps the lantern lit. Your click keeps the wick from drowning. Done? Good. Then picture Jonah as he is. Boots patched, hat sweat-stained, jaw unshaved, because razors cost and time costs more. Picture the dust lifting around his ankles like ghosts of last year's rain. Picture a man who has learned to want little and still finds himself wanting. The morning he first touched the cabin, the sky had that flat color that steals distance. Sound behaved strangely. A far-off truck seemed to pass right through the yard. Jonah spoke his father's name just to hear a human voice, and the sound came back thin as thread. The door in front of him was not grand. It was wood blackened by weather, cross-braced, stubborn. He laid his hand against it the way you lay a hand against a horse's neck, letting the animal know you mean to be kind. Stay with this, and keep that lantern burning with your subscription. The latch lifted without protest, though the metal looked like it should have snapped his skin open. The door swung inward an inch, then another, then caught on something that dragged along the floor like a chain. Jonah leaned his shoulder against it, pushed. The hum he'd heard swelled until it seemed to sit behind his eyes. Inside, dust motes swam in a thin shaft of light like fish in a bottle, turning slow circles that made time feel thicker. The room held almost nothing. A cot under the window, a rough table with one leg braced by a stack of paper, a hook where a lantern should hang. The air was cooler, not from wind, there was none, but from the breath of somewhere else. The sound of water wasn't in his ears now. It was under his feet. Not a trickle, not plumbing. A steady, living run, the sort of sound that turns your mouth to rain. Jonah's tongue felt like cotton. He knelt and set his palm on the dark square. Cool. Damp. He closed his eyes because sometimes what you can't see will tell you more truth than what you can, and let the sound draw a map in his head, a stream or a spring under the cabin. Impossible and obvious at once. He laughed once, a shocked bark, and then the laugh turned into a prayer without words. On the table, the stack of paper at the bracing leg wasn't paper at all, but folded cloth, white as bone, crisp despite the dust. Jonah lifted the lantern, thumbed the striker expecting nothing, and watched a flame bloom with the obedience of a trained dog. The light discovered the edges, walls scarred by heat, a soot mark where a stove had sat and then hadn't. The carved lantern symbol on the outer wall repeated here over the cot, cut with such care that it shone. He had the sudden sense people had waited here with their breath inside their mouths, waiting for night and for mercy. The trapdoor lifted with a reluctant sigh. Below, the cool rose like a greeting. Stone steps descended into darkness no bigger than a root cellar. He should have fetched a neighbor. He should have called the sheriff. He should have told someone with authority before he took another step. Instead, he lowered himself until the lamp's light pressed against the walls and revealed a space long and narrow, built with the focus of a secret. Brick lined the lower halves of the walls. The upper halves were old timber, sealed with pitch that still remembered the hand that smeared it. On a shelf in that small room lay objects arranged like a patient sentence that had waited for its reader. A leather-bound journal, a tin of matches, a folded map tied with twine, and a small brass bell with a handle worn smooth. Jonah set the lantern down and touched the bell. It was cooler than the air, as if it remembered winter. He lifted the journal. The first page held 8 names written in a careful hand, each line followed by a symbol, a star, a cross, a triangle. Beneath the names were dates from before anyone alive had wrinkles. At the bottom of the page, the last entry was not a name but a sentence that made the hair rise along Jonah's forearms. Ring only when help is needed. He stared. The letters glistened as if just set down. He reached with a shaking finger and smudged one. Ink came away on his skin. There was nobody else in the room. There had been nobody in the cabin when he opened it. He could hear nothing but the stream and the slow drum of his own heart. His name wasn't on the page, but he felt seen in a way that made his knees weak. He turned the page. A recipe for a filtration system drawn in precise diagrams. A note about diverting a portion of the water to a cistern beneath the floor, and a portion to a culvert that led somewhere. Another page described the use of blankets to muffle sound, the timing of lanterns, the rhythm of footsteps that wouldn't betray panic. He turned the map over and found tiny holes along one crease, as if someone had tapped through with a nail to mark stars. He held it up to the lantern and the holes aligned with the pattern a child might first learn. The dipper, the North Star pointing toward a line someone had drawn faint as breath. The line ended at a small circle marked with that same lantern symbol. Beneath it, a single word, keep. Back at the grate, he tested the iron with his boot and found it secure. He could see the stream's pebbled floor, each stone rinsed again and again until it looked like truth. The sound wasn't loud. It was faithful. He realized then that the hum he'd heard on the threshold wasn't the cabin at all, but his own body recognizing water like an old friend across a crowded room. In a corner near the steps, a length of rope lay coiled with the care people reserve for tools they trust more than they trust themselves. He lifted it. Tied into the rope were knots at measured distances, and beside each knot, someone had written a number in grease pencil that had dried to chalk. Depths. He fed the rope down, knot by knot, and counted until the last mark kissed the moving surface. He did the math in his head without pencil and felt the answer spread like warmth. More than enough for troughs, gardens, people. But there was the other answer waiting in the margin. Not infinite. He stood a long time before closing the hatch, hand on the lantern, jaw set in that stubborn way you get from saying no to despair more times than you get credit for. "I will not waste you," he said to the dark. "I will not name you a miracle and then behave like a fool." He tucked the map inside his shirt and felt its corners against his heart. He climbed back to the main room and found the source of the dragging resistance on the door. A length of chain with an iron hasp, not fastened, but set so that anyone leaving would have to lift and drop it. A noisy ritual to warn the room that the world wanted in. Jonah lifted the chain gently to let the door close behind him. He stood in the center with the lantern and let the flame breathe, throwing soft gold into corners. Maniacs and miracles both had rooms, he thought. The difference was what you did next. He took stock. The cot held a wool blanket rolled tight with twine. He unrolled it, found a bundle inside, a tin plate, a knife wrapped in oiled cloth, a small leather pouch of dried beans. The air here was cooler, sure, but it was more than that. The cabin felt like a thought kept secret for a century. He ran his hand along a wall and felt the burrs of old nails, the varnished ghost of a shelf, a child's notch marks ascending a doorframe in short, hopeful lines. 4 feet. 4 feet and 3 inches. 5. He touched the highest and tried to see the face that had grinned under it. Neighbors had their eyes on his land the way crows watch a field, angled and patient. News of discoveries travels faster than rain. He told himself he could keep the cabin quiet, do what needed doing, and let months go by before the county ever knew. But fear has a way of pacing, wearing a path in the mind. He pictured the rich man's trucks rolling up, the bank manager with a clipboard, men in boots measuring what they'd soon own. He pictured the sheriff, decent and tired, talking about liability while taking pictures for the file. He imagined a sign staked in front, historical point of interest, followed by the sound of the door closing forever. That night, Jonah didn't sleep at home. He stretched out on the cot with the bell and the journal on the table beside him. The lantern burned low. In the middle of the night, he woke to a sound like footsteps crossing wet stone far below and a voice. Not words. A feeling like the way a hymn gets under your ribs. He spoke into the dark. "Whoever you were, I'll keep it. I'll keep it right." The sound receded. Satisfied or sorrowful, he couldn't tell. Morning brought people. Ruth, his neighbor with a laugh that could peel paint, walked the fence line and called, "Jonah, you decent?" He hesitated, then waved her over. She stepped into the cabin, looked around, and did something unexpected. She took off her hat, folded it over her heart, and stood very still. "My great-grandmother talked about a place like this," she said softly. "They called it the Lantern House. Folks passed north by night, said there was water under it, cold and clean." She traced the symbol above the cot and nodded once, as if greeting an old acquaintance. He poured a tin cup from the stream below, brought it up and held it out to her. He watched her face as she drank. Surprise first, then something like relief that bordered on grief. "You can't tell the county," she said. "They'll put a plaque and a porta-potty and a gift shop." She looked at him, woman to man, neighbor to neighbor. "But you can't do this alone." Over the next days, Jonah entrusted the secret to exactly 3 people he would have trusted with his last piece of bread. Ruth, Pastor Ellis, who'd baptized him when he was 12, and his cousin May, a nurse who understood rules about keeping things that heal out of the wrong hands. They came at dusk, parked half a mile away, walked in without leaving a trail. Together they cleaned, measured, shored up the trapdoor, and studied the journal like a map to a country that existed under their feet. May ran her fingers over the filtration drawing and said, "It's good." Someone knew what they were doing. Pastor Ellis read the names aloud the way he read the roll of the saints on All Souls' Day. The first week they filled barrels at night and carried them quiet as contraband to the troughs in the garden. The cows' eyes rolled white with pleasure when their tongues met water. The garden thought dead, greened at the edges like a bruise healing in reverse. They drew just enough, never greedily. They counted buckets and whispered numbers like a rosary. When Jonah stood in his field and felt the damp rising through the soil, he could not stop the relief that shook him. He could not stop the terror that came with it either. Blessings, he knew, drew attention like porch lights drew moths. Word came that the bank had moved up his meeting. The rich man's trucks were seen idling at the edge of the county road. Pastor Ellis said a thing that made Jonah stand straighter. "When a blessing arrives, expect company." Ruth added, "Practical as a fence post. Expect paperwork, too." They drafted a plan. Register the cabin as a historical site without revealing the spring. Build a cover story for the water as a hauled supply from the river with borrowed permits. Keep the bell for emergencies no one could define but all could feel. They started to record in pencil on fresh pages at the back of the journal what they took and when. like a ledger for Grace. Dates, buckets, reasons. 2 for calves, 3 for May's patient with heat stroke, 1 for Ruth's grandson's scout camp when the tap broke. They argued sometimes, but softly, and always in the end they erred on the side of less. It turned out discipline could feel like joy when the thing you were guarding had guarded people before you. One afternoon the sheriff did stop by, hat in hand, eyes apologetic. "Got a report of trespassers," he said. Jonah could smell the coffee on his breath. "You see anything?" Jonah met his gaze. "Coyote's been bold," he said. The sheriff nodded, understanding more than he said. "Bold year," he allowed, and left his card without writing on it. On the 4th night, men with flashlights moved along the fence. Jonah saw beams lancing the brush and heard a laugh that had lived in his nightmares. The rich man's foreman, a grin you could hear. They reached the cottonwoods and split to circle. Sure, they were hunting a deer stand, a still anything but a house that had refused to exist for 100 years. Jonah's heart went hard. He lifted the bell from the table and rang it once, a clear note that seemed to travel down into the earth and outward into the trees. The beams hesitated. The men muttered. A wind rose that had not been there a breath before, stirring dust into a curtain. The men cursed and went back the way they'd come, swatting at a darkness that had learned to be a wall. They would keep faith with the water and with one another, quietly and well. The bell left a taste of copper in Jonah's mouth. He thought of the warning in the journal, ring only when help is needed. He set the bell down with the tenderness you give a sleeping child and reached for the leather-bound book again. There were pages he hadn't read, because fear and work had kept him skimming. Now he read every line. He learned the cabin had been built in 1859 by a cooper and his wife who hid people moving secretly north. The stream was older still, mapped by local tribes and marked as a living vein that rose and fell with storms a county away. The journal's tone was practical, spare, and then between entries about wood rot and food stores, a sentence in a different hand. "If you keep the purpose, the water keeps you." The next page described a flood year and how the bell was used to warn of patrols, then how the bell was never to be used for selfish need. A later page recorded 1933, writing in a voice clipped and orderly, "Cabin moved thrice." Moved. The word sat on his tongue like a pebble. He read on. The cabin had been dismantled and reassembled across generations, always over the same stone oval, always above the root of the stream. The old coordinates, recorded in a code of lantern symbols and angles of moonlight, triangulated too. Jonah carried the journal into the yard and studied the cottonwoods. The low rise, the way the land curled around the cabin as if sheltering it. He suspected then what the rich man and the county would refuse to learn. The cabin had a way of appearing where it was needed most. Not every drought, not every year, only when a keeper would keep it. The book did not say this outright. It didn't have to. He felt the knowledge perch in him the way a bird perches, light and intent. There was one more entry written in ink that glistened faintly under the lantern's flame, like the note that had smudged beneath his finger days ago. It told of a night in 1936, another year of dust, another farmer making a last choice. The writer described ringing the bell, feeling the ground answer, and then the sky turned a color no one had a name for as wind gathered itself into a wall. The cabin had held, the spring had swollen but not flooded, and dawn had come like a hand laid on a fevered brow. "This is not magic," the writer had finished. "This is a promise. If you hold your door open for the traveling and the thirsty, the earth will hold its door open for you. If you are true as your word, the water will abide. If not, it will pass." The meeting at the bank arrived like a storm that didn't respect fences. Jonah stood in a tie he hadn't worn since his father's funeral, hat in his hands, and listened to numbers framed as mercy. The bank manager's voice was smooth as varnish. "It's not about failure, Mr. Miller. It's about adapting." The rich man waited in the hall, smelling of cologne and gasoline. Jonah thought of the bell, the journal, Ruth's great-grandmother's story, the stream talking in the dark. He thought of leaving, and how leaving would be the easy courage of running. He thought of staying, and how staying requires a different kind of courage. That night, clouds built like mountains far off. Lightning stitched the horizon in quick slashes. Ruth and May and Pastor Ellis came to the cabin with sacks of sand and lengths of hose. They worked until their shirts stuck to their backs and their hands cramped, setting a sluice, checking the grate, reading the journal like a manual. When the first fat drops hit the roof, Jonah heard the old boards relax. The bell, untouched, trembled once. Wind arrived, not a breeze but a body pressed to the cabin's side. The door shook. The chain lifted and fell by itself with a clank like a metronome. The lantern's flame flattened and then stood up hard. Jonah knew in his marrow that this was the test mentioned in the book, an old bargain renewing itself. He put his hand on the journal. He said aloud and steady, "This water is not mine. It is for the traveling and the thirsty." Ruth repeated him, then May, then the pastor, their voices braided. Outside, something big hit the cottonwoods with a crack. The roof groaned. A seam opened and a line of rain threaded the air like a needle. They ringed the bell. Not a panicked clamor, but 3 notes spaced like breaths. The ground answered. No metaphor, not a feeling, a sound. A low chord rising through the stones and into their bones. The stream swelled, clear, unhurried, filling the culvert to the lip without spilling. The grate held. The sandbags held. The door held. The 4 of them stood shoulder to shoulder in the small room underground while water traveled through. A visitor who knew the rules. Tears cut clean tracks on dusty faces. The wind shouted and shouldered the walls. The bell's last note hung over it like a spine. The storm bellowed at the world and then, disappointed, moved on. When they climbed back into the main room, the air smelled new. The roof had lost 2 shingles, nothing more. In the yard, branches lay like shed antlers. The fields beyond were scattered with dark coins of rain. Jonah stepped out and turned his face to the last drops. The rich man's truck sat in the distance like hungry animals denied. He raised a hand, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. He had not won. He had been allowed, for one night, to keep faith with something older than his name. In the following days, a different kind of weather gathered. Letters arrived. A historian from the college in town, tipped by Ruth's cousin, asked careful questions. A quiet woman from upstate who introduced herself as the granddaughter of someone whose name matched the first page of the journal came with a small photograph of a man standing in front of a cabin drawn from memory. Pastor Ellis preached a sermon without mentioning secrets about wells that don't run dry. Jonah filed papers to place a protective easement over the stand of cottonwoods. The bank moved his meeting again. People brought pies. People brought rumors. One evening, alone in the cabin, Jonah set the journal on the table and opened to the last pages. There, written in a hand he now recognized as the same impossible ink, he found a message addressed to no one and to him. "Keeper, do not keep this for yourself. Keep it with others." The words lifted off the page without lifting off the page, meaning sinking all the way into him, not as command, but as release. The miracle was not the water. The miracle was the way it taught them to stand together, to ring for one another, to keep their door the way the earth had kept its door. Jonah blew out the lantern, set the bell by the chain, and sat until night threw its shawl over the fields. The county finally accepted his easement, mostly because the paperwork wore them down and there were bigger fires to put out. The rich man found a different fence to lean on, another poor fool to buy from. The drought loosened its grip by inches, not hours. Grass returned the way forgiveness does, patchy then thick. Jonah paid down what he owed, one envelope at a time. He did not become a hero or a legend. He became what he had been, and now better at it. Keeper, neighbor, man whose word had weight. The cabin stood quiet and busy, a contradiction that made sense if you'd ever watched water work. There was a day, late in the year, when a blue heron landed at the pond the stream had brought back to life. Jonah watched the bird watch its reflection and thought about how water teaches patience. You don't hurry a river, and you don't argue with a spring. Ruth brought over a loaf and told him she'd entered the cabin's history into an archive without saying where it was. May laughed that the county nurse had begun recommending Miller's Miracle Hydrator without a wink. Pastor Ellis stood in the doorway and after a long look said only, "Steady." Jonah nodded. That was the goal. Not victory, not fame, steadiness. So here's the part where I speak to you, listener, viewer, traveler at a screen. If stories like this steady your hands, if you believe that grace can take the shape of wood and stone and disciplined kindness, subscribe to this channel and share this tale. There are more cabins than you think in this world. Most of them look like rooms where someone is willing to wait with a light on. Click subscribe, leave a comment about the hard choice you kept, and send this to the friend who needs water they can't name yet. Let's keep this lantern lit for the next tired traveler. Jonah's moral was not complicated and not easy. Gratitude makes a man careful. Faith makes a man brave. Justice asks a man to open the door when knocking isn't reasonable. Destiny is not what finds you. It is what you choose after you are found. He kept his land because he learned it had never been his alone. He rang the bell only when he must. He shared what he could without wasting what he could not replace. When he walked his fields now, he still spoke to the rows, but the words were different. "Thank you," he said, to soil and sky, to names in a book, to a stream that minded its business until asked. Years later, when a new drought tried to memorize the county again, Jonah found himself older and still quick to smile. He had a granddaughter who liked to touch the bell and then run, giggling, to the door as if sound itself were a game of tag. He taught her the rule with a seriousness that didn't quite hide his pride. 3 slow rings only when help is needed. She nodded gravely, and then asked the sort of question children ask when they are closer to mystery than we are. "Who hears it?" Jonah answered, "The ground." He put a small plaque inside, not outside, so only those already inside would read it. It said simply, "This house keeps travelers." No dates, no names, no boasts, just a truth that fit the room. The county later asked for a copy for their records. He sent them a photograph and a letter with 5 short sentences and no adjectives. He had learned that too many words can make a good thing thin. Remember this as you go. Gratitude sees what is there, not just what is missing. Faith is not a ladder to climb out of trouble. It is the hand you extend to someone else while you are still standing in it. Justice is not a thunderclap. It is the steady work of keeping the door unlatched for the one who needs it. Destiny is not a straight line. It is a braided river fed by choices small as cups of water. If this story steadied you, subscribe, share, and let someone else drink from it. Keep the lantern lit. Thank you for staying with this story, and keep the lantern lit.